Good evening. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum. We're very pleased to welcome you to our first program of 2022. If you're not familiar with the Salisbury Forum, we host free public forums with nationally recognized experts on a large range of topics. To learn about our upcoming events, please go to our homepage and join our email list. You can also find us on Facebook. We have some exciting talks coming up. Jeff Jarvis will discuss the internet and the future of news on March 18th. Thomas Shapiro will be speaking about toxic inequality in April. If you or your friends miss one of our talks, they're all available on our website, www.salisburyforum.org. On behalf of our board, I want to thank all of you who have supported us so generously this year. We rely on your contributions to cover our operating expenses, and so you make it possible for us to continue to bring you these forums. Of course, we're always grateful for any additional contributions you may want to make. You can do it easily from our homepage. We particularly appreciate the grant we've received this year from Connecticut Humanities. We have a Q&A period at the end of the talk, so click on the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen to type in any questions you may have. Please do not use the chat feature, and please stick to questions. We're delighted to have author Jonathan Safran Foer with us tonight. He will be interviewed by Amy Sidran. Jonathan's impressive background includes studying philosophy at Princeton University before enrolling at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. He then shifted gears and decided to pursue a career in writing. He's written a libretto for an opera and has taught writing at Yale University and the Graduate Creative Writing Program at New York University. He's widely acclaimed for his novels, Everything is Illuminated and Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, both of which were adapted into successful films. His first nonfiction book, centered on our diet, Eating Animals, explores the multiple issues involved in eating factory-farmed meat. His current book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast, he focuses on how changes to our diet could help reduce our impact on our environment. As always, his book is available at Oblong Books in Millerton. We're very fortunate to have Amy Sidran with us to interview Jonathan. With a deep background in education, science, and agriculture, Amy joined the Hotchkiss School 2 years ago as the Farm Education Coordinator. Highlighting agricultural sustainability and animal welfare, the school uses its farmland for an educational program for students, as well as a source for food for the campus. Part of their curriculum includes visiting local farms and learning about food systems. And so she's the perfect person to interview Jonathan, given their shared interests. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jonathan and Amy to the Salisbury Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Jonathan, I'm so excited to chat with you tonight and to be able to spend this time talking about something that we're both so passionate about. One of my first questions is, how did you go from writing fiction to deciding that your passions were really lying with animals, animal welfare, your decisions to be vegan and then vegetarian? How did you really come about that process? Like, what was that thought? What were those thoughts like?
Well, first of all, thank you for having this conversation with me. We've had a few sort of preliminary or preparatory conversations, and they've been really lovely. And I am just excited to have this time to talk to you. You referred to it twice as a passion, and I don't know if that's exactly how I feel. It is definitely nothing I ever thought I would write a book about. It's nothing that I ever thought I would devote a good portion of my time and energy to. I might describe it as a problem in my life rather than a passion in my life. And it's not unique in that way. Probably like you and probably like everybody else joined in this event tonight. There are things that are just unresolved in my life. And some of them are relatively new problems, and some of them are really old problems. Climate change is a relatively new problem. It's not something that was on the radar of my consciousness until, I don't know what, 10 years ago, something like that. It's hard to remember. The last 2 years have been so long, it's very hard to remember anything before them. The question of animal welfare and the question of eating animals has been a problem for me pretty much since I learned about it. And that doesn't make me special. I think that most kids find it problematic when they first learn about meat, which is not to say that it's wrong. A lot of things seem problematic to kids that aren't wrong. But in the case of eating animals, whether it's right or wrong, it's definitely antithetical to the other stories that kids are told about animals. And we have pets who we treat really well. If you were to abuse a pet, you would get in big trouble, and you would be taught a lesson about why that's wrong. Most children go to bed with stuffed animals. Most children are put to bed with stories with animals featured as the heroes. And then there's this other thing that we do, which is, and at that point, all I knew was that we eat dead animals. We take dead animals and cut them up and put them in our mouths. I didn't know anything about the process that brought those dead animals to the plate. I didn't know anything about factory farming, but just on the most basic level, it was upsetting to me. I found ways to get over it, like most people do. I got over it because it's what everybody else did. I got over it because I really liked meat. I liked how it tasted. I liked how it smelled. I liked the functions that it served in my life, in my family life, in my culture. In my family and in my culture, food was really a vehicle of love. So, when we would go to my grandmother's house, she would show her love by making lots of food for us. And we would reciprocate that expression by talking about how great it was and, oh, you're the best chef in the world. And so I have tried my whole life to navigate these various parts of my personality and these various instincts that I have. I was never able to get over the instinct that something questionable is happening when we eat animals. You may disagree with me. I think that it's the rarest of person who is able to fully overcome, to have a fully laissez-faire attitude about eating animals. When I wrote the book, Eating Animals, and I went on tour, every blue moon, it was pretty rare. It was much rarer than I thought, but every blue moon, somebody would stand up in the question and answer session and say, who do you think you are, telling us what to eat and what not to eat? Like, what makes you think you're so great? What makes you think you're so smart? And I would always respond by saying, well, we obviously agree that this matters, because you wouldn't be so upset if you didn't think this mattered. If I had written a book about why we should not drink with, I don't know, disposable plastic straws, nobody's going to get up and get upset. Nobody's going to ask me who I think I am. They're doing it because they know that something big is at stake. It's literally life or death, but it's also, and maybe even more importantly, it says something about who we are and what our values are and what we care about and what our tolerance is for violence or cruelty, what our drive is for pleasure and for experience, and how we strike those balances. So I've had a hard time with it my whole life. It's been a problem my whole life. And I'm really lucky as a writer because I have the option, which most people don't have, of making a profession out of my problems, and really putting aside time to dig into them and learn what I can learn. In this case, that involved learning about the world, which was extraordinarily difficult because the world of factory farming is I'm sure the most secretive industry in America after the military. And it required learning about myself. I have lots of strong instincts that if I examine them I realize are wrong, or I realize they're more complex and I am initially assuming they are. So just to return to your question, I don't actually feel passionate. I don't feel excited. More often than not, I feel sad, about what I think of as the distance between myself and the person that I want to be, the person I imagine myself being. And with respect to climate change, a sadness about these tracks that we seem to be on, racing on toward an end that nobody wants. It doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter what your race or gender or age is. It doesn't matter if you're urban or rural. Nobody wants air that we can't breathe. Nobody wants water that we can't drink. Nobody wants a planet that we can't inhabit as we have known it. So that is my relationship to these questions.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. There's so many different pieces there that I've also struggled with. I really relate to so many things that you say, because when I was younger, I decided to be a vegetarian. I guess it was around, I don't know, like middle school, high school. It was for some kind of arbitrary reasons. But when I got to college, a friend gave me a book, and it was by John Robbins. And that really opened up to me the animal welfare piece and why I really wasn't going to eat animals. But kind of something that you mentioned in your book too, is that how righteous it can be about eating meat. And especially when you're younger, I remember things I said to people when I was in my early 20s. And I really can't believe some of the things I said about my righteousness about being a vegetarian. And then I, tried being vegan and all these things. And it's been a cycle in my life as well, trying to figure out what works for me and what not to obsess about. And it makes me sad as well to think about the agricultural industry and what it's doing to our planet, and that we don't really think about it. We think about so many other ways. And I think different books attempt to talk about it in different ways. And I really was fascinated by your book, because this one, the We Are the Weather, is so different than your other book, The Eating Animals, the way you go about it. And how did you, I'm fascinated by writing because it's in 5 very distinct pieces in your book. It's not a typical story, nonfiction writing. It's very different. In the beginning, you really have this collective story that you're telling. And then you go into more about kind of facts. And then you come back and you start talking about your soul and this conversation. And then you continue. But how did you decide to set the book up like that? Or did you not? And it just kind of came about in this really natural, organic way?
A little bit of both. Because there's sort of like 2 hats that one wears, or at least I wear. I don't know exactly what other writers' experiences are, but I try very hard not to have too much of a plan and not to be too outcome oriented when I begin a book, because that ends up prohibiting a certain kind of process of discovery or exploration, or it can frustrate intuitions, because you feel yourself diverging from the path that you had mapped out for yourself. And I find, and this is true for fiction or nonfiction, the things that I stumble upon are more interesting than the destinations that I set out to reach. One of my favorite sayings about writing, which also just applies to everything else, was said by the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky. He said, "The rhyme is smarter than the poet." People write in verse because it's beautiful or it's pretty to end a line with one that rhymes with the word at the end of the line above. But once you've committed to verse, it creates all these problems, because you can't say things the way you would have if you hadn't been constrained. How am I going to make the point I wanted to make and somehow end this sentence with the word that rhymes with tree? That's going to be tricky. And the solution to a problem is revealing, and it's interesting. I've been writing for a while now, and I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what my abilities are. And I say this not in a self-deprecating way and not protesting too much. We're talking and I'm telling you my truth. they don't excite me that much. Like, it's okay, but it's not so special. I wouldn't spend my life leaning on my abilities. But there is something that excites me a lot, which is the process and the ways that a certain kind of process can allow you to transcend your abilities, or to have these like fortuitous accidents that produce really beautiful results that you couldn't have planned. I couldn't have planned. So I do everything I can to leave room for that in my writing process. But then I also obviously am an editor as well of my writing. So if a first draft is sort of a little more like freewheeling and, I don't know, primitive, the editorial part of the process tries to make use of all of that, because at the end of the day, I'm not, a diary writer. I'm an author, and that involves wanting to communicate with other people, and that requires being accessible. That requires being interesting, holding somebody's attention, trying to, especially with topics like food, trying not to turn people off before you've started a difficult conversation. So in the case of this book, I went through a lot of different writing styles, and in a way, more than anything, they just reflect my own thought process. As I said, I didn't have answers. I had a lot of questions, and I felt very confused, and I felt oftentimes like internal contradictions and hypocrisies that were hard for me. Hard both because it's so much nicer to make a strong argument, and hard because they're embarrassing. And I think the shifting tone of the book reflects some of my discomforts.
I think it definitely does. I think it's like that internal difficulty that we have in making decisions like these, to give up meat or to give up something that, like you said, it's culturally important to us. It's socially important to us. It gives us a lot of ways to connect. And I think something about your writing too, with the style and tone, is that you quote, like Randy Olson saying that climate change is the most boring subject ever. And it is. Like, I remember asking my daughter today if she wanted to watch this, and she was like, no. And she's 10. And I said, well, what's climate change? And it was really interesting to hear her response and not really have a response. But I find that in your book, you really hit it with climate change being kind of boring and hard to sell, because it's over there. And it's not, even though you could be having a fire outside of your window, your house could be almost burned down. It's really hard to connect it with that climate change piece. And it was so moving to me how you connected it with the Holocaust, with your grandmother's experience, and that piece, along with, the collective action of Thanksgiving and all these other pieces that you connect. How did you really come to tie all of those together? Because they are really so unique in those ways that they connect to that collective action. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I wish your daughter were here. It would be fun to include her in the conversation. To begin with, I just wrote from experience, and I wrote from my own perspective, and I was drawing upon my own history and my own feelings. I teach writing, and one of the things that I often say to my students is, your brain is doing a lot of work that you're not aware of to make connections and find symmetries and to organize. This is true just from daily experience. Our brain is doing an enormous amount of work to organize the world so that it's comprehensible. Like, here are the details we're going to pay attention to. Here are the details we're going to ignore. Here are the things we're going to fill in. Here are the things we're going to leave as absences. My younger son, who was 13, actually just wrote an article for the school paper about the human inclination to see faces and things, to why an electrical outlet looks a little bit like a face, or why we might see a face in a cloud. And basically we have this like innate instinct, subconscious instinct, to see faces, because evolutionarily that was so important, to know that an individual, another animal, was approaching us, and to quickly try to start to make sense of whether that person was a threat or not. And our brains got so good at doing that work that we weren't even aware of, that it got a little too good and started to see faces where there weren't faces. That kind of brain operating is really useful in writing, because it can, if you trust it, free you up to be more of yourself and less of a writer. And so when I was writing this book, I never sat down and created a little map of ideas and thought, hey, you know what? I could connect Thanksgiving to the polio vaccine, to Jan Karski in Poland, to my grandmother, to climate change. I just tried not to hide my own thought process and my own learning. And in the end, by the way, there were many, many pages I didn't include in the book because they weren't coherent, and they didn't make the book accessible. They didn't clarify anything. So that was when that other part of the writing process came in, of editing and saying, okay, now that I have trusted this process, let's try to take a little bit more control over it. Especially with a book like, with a novel, I might care less, actually. With a novel, I just want to make it for its own sake and come what may. With nonfiction, the kind of nonfiction that I write, it is a kind of advocacy. And because of that, I really want people to be open to what I'm saying. I thought about this a huge amount with eating animals, just the title actually of the book. Like, okay, this book is going to be in an airport bookstore. How many times in my life have I seen somebody, or how many times have I been the person who takes a book off the shelf, looks at the cover, looks at the back, and thinks like, I don't need this right now. Life is hard enough. The week is long enough. I just don't need this right now. So when there with my nonfiction, there is something I want to share, even if I don't exactly know the path of the sharing or the shape of the sharing. And so I feel more beholden to the reader and to a kind of sharing that will open somebody up rather than close them down.
I definitely felt like this book, even in the title, just "We Are the Weather," it really gives ownership and puts it on someone that when they read this book, they might connect with it. And I think my husband gave me Eating Animals a long time ago when I was kind of struggling with my own choices and figuring out whether I was going to maintain the vegetarianism that I had kept for so long. But then when I met my husband, he hunted. And so to me, that was a real reckoning as well to what I had previously kind of thought about being vegetarian. And then he hunted elk. We lived on the West Coast, and I started eating meat, and I ate elk, and then we raised pigs, and I thought, I'll never eat these pigs. I won't do it. And then I was eating the pork. It was so interesting to me, the relationship I started to have with animals in a way that I had never had before. I was never around animals growing up. And I think in your book, it just reinforced that connection that I have with animals. And I haven't eaten beef since I was in middle school. That to me, I don't know what it is. Like you said, there's a connection that you have with animals. And for me, it's with cows. And I don't know why it's cows over other animals. But what I have become really passionate about is kind of, I don't want to call it regenerative because that's really a catchy word these days, but farming in a way that's healthy to the planet in a sense, but also it kind of contradicts some of the ways that we think about agriculture as well, and the more that comes out about agriculture. And I kind of want to ask you about that, because in the book, you really, you define those 4 ways that are the main contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, and those are pretty pretty obvious, right? About, we need to drive less, or driving isn't the main one, right? One of them, like airplane pollution, eating animal agriculture. And then, what was the other one? Oh, having less children, right?
Mhm.
How many children you have obviously is a huge contributor. And you've chosen animals in a way that's yours, that's your big piece. It seems like, from this book and from what you're advocating for. And then I'm trying to put this together. It's like, how do you feel about local agriculture? Because obviously the big picture with industrial agriculture, between, what your numbers are, 14% and 51%, which is, I don't think most people know that. I think that's just astounding. And I think we had spoken about the New York Times article and opinion pieces, the videos that are coming out. But I don't know if people are ready yet to hear it. And you talk about that in your book too. Do you want to talk? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you're talking about a few things. One, it's interesting how you talked about how your exposure changed your relationship to these questions. That's just an incredibly important point, whether it's exposure to animals or exposure to information. Before 1820, 72% of Americans were somehow involved in agriculture. Now it's about 1.5%. There are the same number of farmers in our country. I don't mean per capita, I mean as a number. There are the same number of farmers in our country now as there were during the Civil War. It's an absolutely insane thing to wrap your head around, and then to try to figure out, well, how could that be true? Because our population has doubled 11 times since then. It's true because the methods of farming have completely changed. And a kind of farming that most of us visualize when we think about farmers, if you were to ask most people here tonight, like, what's a farmer? What comes to mind? I imagine most people would describe the kind of farming that you are involved with and that you teach. Farmer, outdoors, animals are outdoors. Animals are, if not known by name, are known as individuals in one way or another. Animals that get medical attention, animals that aren't given antibiotics to grow faster or to conceal disease, animals that haven't been bred to become so big, in the case of chickens, for example, that their legs will break under the weight of their own bodies if they're not killed in their adolescence. We imagine like the sky, we imagine the earth. We don't imagine massive manure pits that leach into the water table. We don't imagine what the UN has called one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, locally and globally: air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a real problem when we are all imagining something that isn't the reality. The reality in America is that 99% of the animals that we eat come from factory farms. It's not a coincidence or accident that we don't have images of factory farms in our mind. They're very secretive. They're kept out of the public view because anybody, and I say this, have you ever been inside a factory farm, by the way?
No. I've seen many images and
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, that's an interesting fact in and of itself, that you, who are a student of and teacher of agriculture, have never been in the kind of farm that produces 99% of the animals that we eat. It's like a staggering fact. Everybody, you don't have to be a card-carrying member of PETA. Your husband, who's a hunter, if he walked into a factory farm, would be disgusted.
Yeah.
Just disgusted. He would say, this is not what I want. There's got to be a better way to do this. And for anybody who doubts that, the New York Times piece that you alluded to, which came out, I don't know, a couple of days ago.
Yeah, the chicken one, just a couple days ago.
Chicken is it's worth watching for that reason.
For sure.
So the methods have changed really radically. Our diets have changed really radically. The amount of meat and dairy that we eat now in America is the equivalent to every citizen excuse me, this is true globally. Every citizen in 1700 eating 950 pounds of meat and 1,200 gallons of milk a day. So obviously, a lot of that is due to population growth, right? It's not that we're eating 950 times the amount of food, but those realities are still salient, because like a huge part of this story is that there are going on 8 billion people on Earth. I have, as I hope I make clear in both Eating Animals and We Are the Weather, huge respect for traditional farmers, for what are sometimes called small farmers or family farmers. That's the kind of farming that you, I believe, teach. We could get into later what some of my issues with those kinds of farms are, but they're actually, I think of them as more personal. And when I write in a kind of with the sort of advocacy hat on, I'm thinking about scale and thinking about, as communities, as countries, and as a planet, what is possible, what's tolerable. Animals take up a huge amount of land compared to other foods. It takes between 6 and 26 calories put into an animal to get 1 calorie out. I have never met a climate scientist, and I've never met a student of agriculture who wants to make the case that we can eat meat in the ways that we are, regardless of the farming method. The IPCC, in their latest report, said we have no hope of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accords unless we dramatically reduce our meat and dairy consumption. The most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between climate change and food was published in Nature magazine in 2019. And the authors who studied food systems around the planet said that there are people in places where there are caloric deficits and nutritional deficits who could afford to, and where it's impossible to produce other kinds of food, who could eat more meat and dairy. But for citizens of Europe and the United States, we need to eat about 90% less meat and consume about 60% less dairy in order to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. If the question is, are there good ways to produce these foods? I guess it depends what you mean by that question, but my instinct is yes, there are. If the question is, are there ways to feed 8 billion people the amounts of meat that we currently eat and the amount of dairy that we currently consume? The answer is no. So I think it's interesting when I was listening to you walk through your own personal journey. You did what a lot of people do and what I do often. I've tried very hard to train myself out of it, but it's hard, which is you described it as almost like an on-off switch, binary. Like I was vegetarian for a while, and then this thing happened, and then I was a meat eater. And then I was like vegetarian for a while again because this thing happened, and then I was a meat eater again. And I don't know exactly why it is that we talk about it that way. If it's just conversationally easier, I don't think that's it. If it's because it feels like an identity rather than just a daily choice or a 3 times a day choice. Or maybe it's just because we feel vulnerable and we're so afraid of being called out as a hypocrite that we would rather sort of do nothing than do it partially. Most people know that feeling. If you've ever experimented with vegetarianism, I'm sure you know the feeling of somebody saying to you, yeah, but you wear leather shoes, or yeah, but I saw you step on that ant, or whatever. There's no end to that kind of game. But it makes us vulnerable again because we know that the stakes are high. So my feeling is rather than get into, is this kind of farming good or is this kind of farming bad? Should we all become vegetarians? Or my feeling is, look, let's just be aware of what the choices are in front of us. Let's be aware that there are choices at all. This is not an inevitability. You know, most Americans, not all Americans, but most Americans do have a fair bit of choice in what they eat. Not only whether it's meat or not meat, but if you eat meat, what kind of meat you eat, or if you eat vegetables, what kind of vegetables you eat. And those choices have really profound implications, you know, for our bodies, for our families, for our communities, for farmers, and for the planet. And it's good to try. You know, perfection is not attainable, and it's not necessary. It's not necessary to save the planet, and it's also not necessary to make an indentation on the amount of cruelty in the world. You know, it's something that often happens to me is I'll meet people who have read Eating Animals or We Are the Weather. Very often somebody will say something like, hey, I was so persuaded by your book, I've been a vegetarian for whatever, 3 weeks going strong. I'll say, hey, that's really cool. That's great. Just make sure you're setting yourself up for like success and not failure. Because if somebody who's a vegetarian for 3 weeks, there's going to come a time when they want to eat meat if they're like everybody else. You know, very few people can go from having one diet for their entire life and then just turning it off and switching. So what happens on that, 20-second meal if that person, I don't know, eats a burger? Well, then they failed. That was it for the vegetarian experiment. Whereas if you just phrase the same choices a little bit differently, say, hey, I learned this information. It matters to me. It really does. And I'm just going to try. And then you eat meat on that 20-second meal. Well, if you are batting 21 out of 22, that like gets you into the Hall of Fame of eating. That's really amazing. Same choices, but just a slightly different way of looking at it. So with all of these things, I try to I have a hard time, especially when I care about something, tolerating nuance. It just feels better to say it's wrong and I've stopped. It feels better. You think it sounds better to other people. But that doesn't mean that it's working or sustainable. So I try really hard, and it really requires a lot of effort to quiet that temptation or that need, and to make one choice, in front of the other in ways that are reflections of what I care about.
I think that's something really powerful in your book too, is that you don't come out and say people should give up meat completely. You give them the opportunity to understand what that might look like, and the compassion around these choices too, that, I really identified with the meat for dinner or at one meal, animal products, but thinking about the other meals and trying to figure out how to give those up instead of saying it's all or nothing and you have to give up to become vegetarian. I think some people need that ease into that behavior attempt of what would it look like if I gave up meat at one meal, or what would it look like if I gave up meat at 2 meals, and started thinking more about what I'm actually consuming. I taught a food systems class this fall, and I had brought up a lot of these conversations about farming and about where their food came from. And I had a student that said, I'm going to the dining hall, and for the first time, I'm looking at food and thinking about where it's coming from. And he said, as an athlete, I've thought about food as just a means to an end, like protein. I just need all this food to, compete and be an athlete. But now I'm looking at it thinking, well, who farmed this? What farm did it come from? Where, what ethical situations happened when I'm eating this, and what is it going to do to me? And I was just so excited that person started to think about it, because that's when I started thinking about it, and those big questions started happening. And I think that's a lot of what your book talks about, is the collective action, not just that your choice is your own, but that if we are actually going to make an impact on climate change, because I have to try to not be dark, because your book has turned me a little dark. Not turned me, but like just brought up more things in my life that I have kind of pushed aside in a sense, like the sixth mass extinction. Like all these things are happening. We're in it. We're living through this. So what are we making decisions about? What are we going to choose to fight for? I think it's on the back of your book. I have it, and it's just been so powerful to me. Not the back of your book. It was this quote that, gosh, I read it to my husband the first time I read it, and it said, if we accept a factual reality that we are destroying the planet, but are unable to believe it, we are no better than those who deny the existence of human-caused climate change, just as Felix Frankfurter was no better than those who denied the existence of the Holocaust. And when the future distinguishes between those two kinds of denial, which will appear to be a grave error and which is an unforgivable crime?
Yeah, at this point in time, there are very few climate deniers, in the sense of people who deny the science of climate change. I think something like 86% of Americans now accept the basic science of human-caused climate change. 70% of Americans wanted the US to stay in the Paris Climate Accords, which includes, by the way, the majority of Republicans. This is often painted as a left or right issue. And there's some extent to which that's kind of true. I mean, there are leanings, but the majority of Republicans want the US to be in the Paris Climate Accords. Twice as many Americans believe in the what was that statistic? God, it was so great. Believe in the existence of climate change as I'm going to come back to on that. It was a funny statistic about how many people believe in Bigfoot. But anyway, the issue is not believing in science. The issue is believing in the implications of science. There are two kinds of climate change deniers: those who say it's not happening, or it's not happening in the way that the scientists describe, and those who say it is happening. I'm going to go to marches, I'm going to get the bumper sticker, but I'm not going to make the changes that I know are required of me. And I fall into that category. I do. And I know very few people who don't. I live a lifestyle that would suggest that I'm a climate change denier. And I'm obviously like in this conversation with you in front of these people, talking a nice game and saying the right things, but that's not what matters. Certainly the planet doesn't care what we say or what kind of bumper stickers we put on our cars. It does care what kind of cars we drive, and how much we drive, and how much we fly, and how many kids we have, and the choices that we make at every meal. So as I said in the beginning, I wrote this book because I had a problem, and that was my problem. The problem was, how can I know everything that I know and believe that it matters to me a lot, and yet I'm just not doing what's required? How do I square that? Am I capable of the kind of change that's required? And if not, then what? And I found that very hard. And writing the book did not resolve any of that for me. It clarified it for me. And what you just said about the book made you a bit darker. Imagine what it did to me. I found it really hard, really tough. But look, that's our predicament. And and we're really lucky to have it. If an alien or a higher power came down and said, look, I'm going to cut you a deal. You can have all of this. You can have 365 days a year when it's healthy to be outside. You can live in coastal cities. Your children can have exposed skin when they're outside. You can have life expectancies in the mid or high 80s. You can have this incredible biodiversity, incredible diversity of food options, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to give you all of that, but I do need just a couple of things in return. I need you to not eat an unlimited amount of these very specific foods. You can still eat them if you want to, but you just can't eat them all the time. And I need you to control how many kids you have. And I need you to control how often you fly. You don't have to stop flying, but you do need to be very thoughtful about it. Who wouldn't take that deal? Who wouldn't jump at that deal? The problem is we're not presented it as a deal. We're just so accustomed to having everything whenever we want it. Mm-hmm. And we've never been more used to that than we are right now. As Mary said about buying the book at the local bookstore, that no one didn't need to used to say that. It just went without saying. When I grew up, you just bought your books at a local bookstore. Now we live in a world in which that suddenly seems like a massive effort. I don't remember it having been a massive effort. The notion of having to wait a day or 2 days seems like intolerable. Mm-hmm. It was never the case before that it was intolerable. We are paying such a huge price. We are paying the price of everything because of how our expectations of having an unlimited quantity of whatever it is that we want exactly when we want it. And that's just not the deal that the planet is making with us. And we're going to have to choose. And if we choose having whatever we want in whatever quantity we want, whenever we want it, we will be able to do that for about another generation. You and I will be able to do that. I don't think our kids will be able to do that, and our grandchildren will definitely not be able to do that. So we have to be honest with ourselves about, what we face, and honest with ourselves about what we're capable of. It's one thing to say, hey, wow, I'm persuaded. Tomorrow I'm a vegan. Tomorrow I stop flying. Tomorrow I walk everywhere, and so on. But very few people can do that. I haven't been able to do that. I haven't even tried to do that, but I know what my limitations are. And so we have to really struggle in a way that's going to be particular for each of us. There isn't a prescription. My book offers some suggestions, but there's not a prescription that's going to work for everybody. I find it hard, but relatively easy in the scheme of things. Relatively easy not to eat meat. I find it utterly impossible, the notion of not flying. That's just, I couldn't do it. There are plenty of people who never get on planes ever and would find it utterly incomprehensible to eat less meat. So I hope that they can respect me, and I know that I can respect them when we share what our limitations are and share what our efforts are.
Yeah, they're really personal, right? These decisions are so personal, and our beliefs are so strong, as we know. Especially, I know you wrote the book before the pandemic, and then as things have kind of evolved, and with all of the different climate events that are happening, in a sense, it feels more pressing, in a sense, the book, and also just like there's almost some more inaction in some ways around that. Like there's this feeling of like, well, what can I do? And I think that's something that I really identified with your book, was that it wasn't just the facts that you brought, it was all of these personal stories and the connections that you made, even with your conversation with the soul at that time in the book is so unique, that like back and forth. And a friend of mine read the book and she said that is something that she kind of goes through all the time with those conversations of like, well, what are you doing? And I find myself doing it with like, okay, am I going to have an egg today? I'm going to have an egg right now. And oh, there's some bacon. I know, oh, now I'm having bacon, like, but I'm only having it for lunch. So then I've started to, be more conscious of my choices at other meals. And I think that's just what people have to figure out for themselves. Like you said, is that they respect your decision to choose food, but maybe their decision will be not to fly or to have less children or not driving.
Yeah.
But one of those, I think, has to be decided on.
I would really recommend food for most people because, something like 3/4 of people who own cars in America use them to get to work. And it's not fair, and it's not realistic to say, find another way to get to work. So many Americans live in situations where they have no other means of getting to work. I suppose they could like carpool, which is great, but about half of all flights that are taken are for non-leisure or personal purposes. So for visiting a sick relative or for work, it's tricky. There is some reduction that can be made, but it's tricky. And having children is just another story altogether. Frankly, we have no hope in any real department of human existence if we don't somehow get overpopulation under control. But most people listening to this right now probably aren't contemplating having another kid right this second. Like it's not an immediate decision for most people. But food is a choice that we make 3 times a day. The impact is really profound. It has as you may or may not have experienced, it has like a kind of contagious effect, both within you and within your community, which is another reason I think it's a good thing to start modestly. You try, and then you find it wasn't as hard as you thought, and it even feels good, and you feel sort of inspired by your own empowerment, and it starts to expand. People who do like Meatless Monday, I bet you there aren't that many people who stop there. And then within our communities, I write about this in the book, these habits really they spread. They're contagious. A kind of funny negative example of that, or not that funny, is with farm salmon, which was developed to protect wild salmon populations, which were on the brink of crashing. But exactly the opposite of what people expected happened, which is it increased demand on wild caught salmon because it increased the kind of cultural appetite for salmon as it became more available. And when you see somebody in a restaurant eating salmon, it's the rare person who will say to the waiter, "Hey, is this farm caught or is this wild salmon?" Most people will just say, "That looks great. I'll have the salmon too." So we have to be really careful about the choices that we make. We also live in a world in which our choices have never been more witnessed and consequential than they are now. If you start eating less meat, I promise you Google will know about it, and Facebook will know about it, and Apple will know about it, and Amazon will know about it. Just try. It's a kind of interesting little experiment. Like for a month, go vegetarian for a month and just see what happens. See if you start getting ads, if you start getting recommendations, if the algorithm notices. That's horrible in just about every single way. In this particular way, there's something good about it. That you can start to affect change just without even trying to, with your individual choices. But it also happens on the level of like restaurant eating or grocery store shopping. People notice what's in people's grocery carts. When you're at the cafeteria and you go for the vegetarian option, people notice. When you're in a restaurant and you ask the waiter, "What would you recommend that's vegetarian tonight?" Like the person you're sitting across from notices. The waiter notices. The waiter at a certain point is going to mention it to the chef or to the food buyer. These things start to resonate in some really profound ways.
I think about when I was vegetarian in high school and no one really knew what that was. And I had to explain, I didn't eat chicken. That's not a vegetarian.
Yeah.
But then, fast forward to like 25 years later, and being a vegan, vegetarian, it's so easy to go and get alternative foods, to have more vegetables. Like there's so many options. And that's something that I try to talk about a lot too, is choosing to be a vegetarian, but then choosing, processed food options can almost not as bad as meat, but when you're, eating processed soy that's, genetically modified and was, raised in the Amazon, or all these ways, it's really important to be conscious about the way that you go about being vegetarian. Obviously it's less impactful than meat, but it can be negative to the environment as well. And
it can. I mean, it's worth pointing out 98% of the world's soy crop goes to animal agriculture. Yeah. And I completely agree with what you're saying, that these processed foods aren't good for us, and they're not good for the environment, and they're not a good solution, but they are still a lot better.
It's
They're
true.
still a lot better.
Yeah.
But we need to go back. I mean, the future just needs to look like the past. It doesn't have to look like designer foods. It doesn't have to look like things that are grown in labs. We need to farm like our grandparents farmed, or our parents probably. And we need to eat like they ate. And that'll actually solve this problem. But we have been sold a lot of ideas. When you're referring to that athlete student, you said that student became aware of where food comes from. I would encourage a student also to become aware of where the notion that, I think it was, did you say it was a he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the message also, for sure.
Where the notion that you have to consume tons of protein comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not medically based. The average vegetarian in America eats twice the recommended daily allowance of protein. Like, if you were to just survey, most like lay people about the pitfalls of vegetarianism, I assume a ton of them would say, where do you get enough protein?
For sure.
We consume way too much protein, too much for our health in the United States. So the factory farm industry has not only ruined farming, or done its best to ruin farming, it's just ruined everything. It's ruining the planet. It's ruining our eating habits. We like a third or 40% of meals in America are now eaten in automobiles. That was brought to us by the factory farm industry, and obviously in cooperation with the fast food industry. Where is it that it used to be, even when I was a kid, but certainly when my parents were kids, dinner took a long time. Growing food took a long time. Cooking food and preparing food took a long time. And eating at the table took a long time. It was not as efficient as it is now. But what do we get for the efficiency, and what do we lose when we lose that slowness? The dinner table used to be the place where values were transmitted, where people would get to know each other. And food was so much more pleasurable because it was slower, because more attention was paid to it. Everything in life is more pleasurable when more attention is paid to it. And it's really worth, I wish, as I wish your daughter were here, I wish that student were here, to just sort of interrogate some of his ideas about eating and really like push on them a little bit.
Yeah.
Where does the idea come from that you need all of this protein? Where does the idea come from that this kind of food is wholesome? It's hard to imagine a more potent symbol of wholesomeness than the Thanksgiving turkey. That is it. That is like the central image of food wholesomeness in America. There is not a turkey that is sold in a supermarket in America that was the product of sexual reproduction. Just think about that for a second. Like, they're not capable of reproducing sexually anymore because they've been bred to such an extent that they literally can't have sex. So it's all artificial insemination.
Right.
How can an animal that doesn't reproduce be our model of wholesomeness? I love the idea of wholesome food. I really do. I love the idea of Thanksgiving as well. I love the holiday, but that is the wrong symbol for those themes.
It's like the beef industry too, right? I think all beef cattle are also artificially inseminated. I don't think any of them for fear of hurting the animals at this point. That's a lot of what happens. And they pick the mates and all of that. And I think that information, the more we disseminate the information about the practices and people understand that the ideals that we have for the factory farm, or that the farms are not real, that the factory farm is actually what we are eating from. And I feel like we should answer, I think there's a question too. I was going to check and see what one of the questions was. It says, there are many species that are carnivores, including man. I understand your objection to factory farming, but do you also have issues with hand-raised or organic farming of animals?
Well, organic isn't necessarily saying as much as one thinks it is. It's without a doubt better, for sure. For sure, it's better. But it doesn't always mean what people think it means, and it depends on a lot of this terminology. All the terminology depends on the animal species that we're talking about. So there's sort of like two questions inside of that question, like how do I feel, and which is quite personal. I don't mean in the sense that I'm not going to talk about it. I just mean what I think is right for me, I don't necessarily think is right for anybody else. Mm-hmm. And then the things that we really do need to come to some agreement on, just as a human community. So personally, I do still have a problem with hand-raised animals. And that is for two reasons. One, which is easier to talk about, is I think it's just a luxury item, and I don't think that it can be scaled to 8 billion people. And so how excited do I want to get, or how strongly do I want to endorse an exception that really does prove the rule? Is it possible for me to imagine a situation in which child labor would be good for a kid? It is, yeah. I can imagine a situation in which it would save the kid's life to have a job, maybe hold that kid's family together. Do I have an issue with child labor? I do. Because when you scale that kind of power imbalance, and when you scale that system, it's going to be abused. And the stakes of that abuse are really profound. So I just don't want to get involved with it. Even if I can look at something and say, I have no problem with that. That looks good to me. I'm glad that that specific case exists. I still don't want to endorse it. I don't want it because I know that it can't be. I know that it cannot be replicated, and certainly can't be replicated across the globe. The other issue is just like how big the earth is, how many people we have, and I mean, I guess this is pretty closely related, but enough free-range chicken is produced in America right now to feed the citizens of Staten Island. We're not. These are small numbers, and it's boutique, and I feel mixed. I feel really. It's probably obvious from the way I'm answering the question. I have like mixed feelings about it. I went to farms when I was researching eating animals that were just beautiful. I don't mean physically beautiful, although they were that too, but I mean really thoughtful, sensitive farmers who care about the planet as much as anybody alive and care about animals an incredible amount. And I couldn't find anything wrong with those farms. Not only that, if I were an animal and I were presented the option of having a life on that farm, which would end with slaughter or not being born, because that is what we're talking about. There aren't going to be cows if we have no beef industry or dairy industry. I think I would choose that life. So that made it really hard to make a kind of comprehensive argument against all animal farming. But even those farmers had huge problems with the notion of like global animal agriculture attempting to feed 8 billion people the amount of meat and dairy that we're used to.
I'm going to just jump in here a little bit because I have a question I want to ask. And also I want to say, whoever's in the audience, please write into the Q&A any questions you may have. But in the meantime, my question is, do you see any way to have government policy that might encourage this transition? For instance, by moving subsidies for the cattle industry and other kinds of sort of our meat industry, et cetera, into supporting more the growth of more fruits and vegetables to make them more affordable and more accessible to people. Where maybe meat becomes more expensive, but fruits and vegetables are cheaper and therefore more available. I don't know enough. I mean, neither of you are government policy experts, so I'm just throwing this out if you're knowledgeable about this or have an opinion.
Well, first of all, fruits and vegetables are cheaper. Harvard University did a study that found that a vegetarian diet is $750 a year less expensive than a carnivorous diet or an omnivorous diet. People who make less than $35,000 a year are 2.5 times more likely to be vegetarian than people who make more than $75,000 a year. And people of color are disproportionately vegetarian. So there's this kind of idea out there that it's elitist to talk about vegetarianism. And that's just a lie. It's not true. And it's a lie brought to us by the factory farm industry, which is flailing for any argument against what everybody knows. When I wrote these 2 books, I would sometimes go on TV shows or radio shows, and the producers would, many times, the producer would call me the night before and say, can you suggest anybody who might like sit across the table from you and, just to present the other side? I said, well, hey, you're asking me. It's not my job. And they said, we're just having a really hard time finding somebody. And it's because the industry would never, ever put a spokesperson forward, because they knew that the more that people talk about this and the more they think about it and the more information they're exposed to, we all reach the same conclusion, which is not vegetarianism. It's that the system is broken and we don't want to support it. We just don't want to support it with our money. So there are, Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren put forward some anti-factory farming legislation, which was pretty impressive and has no hope of passing. If the laws that were already on the books were enforced in terms of environmental cleanup, that would go a long way. Companies like Smithfield, they had 8,600 violations of the Clean Water Act in 1 year. So if they'd had 10, we would say, that's not very good. If they'd had 50, we would say, ooh, somebody really needs to keep an eye on this company. 8,600 is a business model. It's not accidents. And it's ridiculous to think of them or refer to them as such. These companies will all go bankrupt if they have to play by the rules that are already on the books. So simply enforcing the rules that are already on the books would completely reshape agriculture in America. We also need to be honest about the impact. When we don't calculate methane when tabulating greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and whenever we go to climate talks, that's always been a sticking point of ours, is not to include methane emissions, because that will make it impossible to farm animals, to farm beef, cows, in the ways that we have. So we need to be honest, and we need to enforce the laws that are on the books, and we need to create new laws that incentivize, as you're saying, different kinds of farming and different kinds of eating. The cost of a hamburger is about $1.50 at the cash register. And there have been studies that when trying to take into account the cost, if we were to remove subsidies and take into consideration environmental cleanup, a hamburger could cost $70 or $80. So what happens to that price difference between $1 and $70? Does it just disappear, or does somebody else pay it? Somebody else pays it. It's just not us. Right now, there are people halfway around the world who are paying it in the places that are already being tragically impacted by climate change, and then our kids and grandkids will pay it.
Yeah, I see here there's a question. What do you see as the role of meat substitutes, such as Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burgers? Can they effectively wean us off real meat? What are the downsides of such products?
I want to say what, sorry, Jonathan,
Yeah,
I just
go
want
ahead.
to say something about the organic question. I think that, like, as you're talking about, there's almost zero regulation with conventional agriculture. I think the one benefit to organic agriculture is that it is highly regulated. There are problems with it, but at least you have to be documented. It's incredibly well documented data. You have to keep records. You have to be observed. You have to have someone come to your farm and actually approve that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so organic agriculture isn't the solution, but it is a better way because at least it's being regulated, and those farmers have to be saying what they're doing and held accountable for the way that they're farming, and those practices have to be written down, and that regulation that comes out.
It's over-regulated in certain ways.
Yeah. And it's
They make
amazing
it
it's even regulated, and those
they
other
make
ones.
it, they make it very, very difficult for good people to do the right thing.
Yeah.
In terms of plant-based meats, I think they're great. I don't think that one should, eat them all the time, but I don't think one should eat meat all the time. In terms of a substitute for the times when you might have eaten a burger, I think it's clearly better. Better for the environment by a great long shot. Better for animals, clearly. Better for our bodies, we don't really know yet. Again, I don't think it's something to eat all the time, but we're not talking about eating it all the time. We're talking about eating an Impossible Burger instead of a Big Mac. And in that situation, it's a godsend. It could really change the world.
And I've read that actually they're making strides in sort of plant-based shrimp and chicken as well.
It's a matter of time before.
It's heavily processed, but they're making, great
Well,
advancements.
meat is heavily processed too. It's
Yeah.
To say it's heavily processed is not fully honest, because we're comparing it to foods that require animals being given antibiotics to grow as quickly as they do and stay as fit as they do, have lighting, the day-night cycles are artificially changed, that the animals are confused about how long a day is, so that they will lay eggs more regularly. That strikes me as processed as well. The best diet is, and Michael Pollan is right, it's just real food, food that doesn't have a ton of ingredients, and that you recognize and that you could trace back to the source, and mostly, if not exclusively, plants.
So as we're getting to the end of our evening, I was wondering, is there anything that either one of you want to say in particular? Any points you want to make? I'm just looking here. Let's see, now I see more questions have come in. Can you talk about the role of lobbying in Congress in supporting the factory farms? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I don't have a ton to say about that, other than I don't think I will have anything revelatory to say about it. It's a really powerful lobby, and it makes legislation like the kind that Cory Booker put forward impossible to pass. It makes it impossible to be honest about science. It's anti-scientific, and it's anti-human. I think just as a final note that I might say, I just really appreciate the tone of the conversation, Amy. Like, one might not have known this watching, but we do come from slightly different places, right, in this conversation. But we actually don't really come from slightly different places in this conversation. I think it's really important to talk about these sometimes very personal and very difficult issues with humility and with goodwill, like an assumption that the other person is not out to attack you, but to like learn with you. And we need, I mean, this is very true for this conversation, and it's very true for so many political conversations in our country now. We just need to find a different way to have them that are generative rather than destructive. We just have no hope if we can't come to a better way of talking. And I just really appreciate that you never spoke out of like defensiveness or aggressiveness, but like these obviously we have shared values, even if we sometimes reach different conclusions, and it's those shared values that will save us.
I agree. I appreciate that. I feel the same way. I feel like I've been so excited to have this conversation because I've just had so many questions that I always kind of ruminate within me around these. And I think the more honest we are about how we struggle with these decisions, and that there's no perfect response to what we're doing, but we're all trying, and we all do want this planet to be the healthiest place for our children and grandchildren. And we obviously want the best for the planet, but how do we get there? And I think that collective action, all of us have to do something, and we don't have to agree upon what it is, but it's beyond time. Like you've said numerous ways in your book, that we're in the fire, and there's no more real time to talk about it. It's just deciding how we act and what those actions look like and how they're supported by each other, because we're all we have, really.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who came tonight.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you both enough for sharing your thoughts, and your passions for this, the challenges involved. Hopefully our audience will, leave tonight, reflecting more on what their diet is, what they can do, because I know, Jonathan, a lot of your book is sort of encouraging people, one by one, to think about, what they can do to make a difference, and that we all have it in our power to at least improve the situation. So thank you so much for writing the book and for sharing your thoughts and your background and your knowledge with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So anyway,
Thank
good
you.
night, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.